All right, today, class, we are going to be looking at graphs of real world situations. So, we are going to be identifying and interpreting key features of graphs, as well as determining the reasonable domain and range for a real world situation. So, right here to the left is our word problem that we're going to use to graph our line on our graph and also answer these three questions or these steps. All right, so a taxi ride costs an initial rate of $3, which is charged as soon as you get in the cab, plus $2 for each mile traveled. The cost of traveling X miles is given by the function f of x equals 3 plus 2x. What are the reasonable domain and ranges? So, the first thing we need to do is sketch the graph. And we sketch the graph by using this equation. Remember that f of x is the same thing as y. So this f of x equals 3 plus 2x is y equals 3 plus 2x. And we can go ahead and write that in standard form for slope intercept form and put our slope first. So f of x equals 2x plus 3. If you do it that way, then it would be easier for you to graph. So remember that the positive 3 is the y-intercept. All right. And the 2 is the slope. And because it's not a fraction, the slope is going to be 2 over 1. So I'm going to first sketch my graph by doing my y-intercept, which is 3. So 0, comma 3. I'm going to go up and place a dot on 0, comma 3. And then my slope is 2 over 1. So I'm going to go up 2. So 1, 2 over 1. And you can do that a few times, especially if you don't have a ruler. All right. So I'm going to connect this as straight as I can. I don't have a ruler with me, so I'm going to connect it as straight as I can. All right. Now we're going to move on to step number 2. All right, so now that we have our line drawn, we're going to move on to step number 2. It says determine the reasonable domain. Think about what the x value represents or x variable represents. So what value makes sense? So when we're thinking about a real world situation, we really have to look at the description that we're given. So in this case, we're talking about a taxi ride, how much it costs. The x value is the domain, and the cost of traveling x miles. So X is representative of miles, right? So X is going to be equal to the amount of miles that are being traveled, while Y is going to be equal to the cost, okay? The cost of the miles. All right, so when we're determining the domain, we have to think about the amount of miles that are being traveled. So we can only really look at the graph that we have here, right? And one thing I also want to point out is that you see these arrows that we have at the end of the graph. That means that the graph continues, okay? It is a continuation, so it's a continuous graph. So when we're looking at the values of x, okay, we can see this is x, this is y. We see that the graph, if it continues, it's going to continue going up, which means it's going to go further across the x axis. So we would then say that a reasonable domain for the x values would be x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay. Now, the reason why, even though this line here is going down in the negative quadrants, when we think about this, okay, reasonable means like, does it make sense for the situation at hand? Distance cannot be negative, right? So when we're talking in terms of miles, we won't say that X is going to be less than 0 because anything that's less than 0 is negative, right? So miles can be negative. You do not travel negative miles. Therefore, we can travel anywhere from 0 miles, meaning we're not going to travel, all the way up to 1,000 miles, right? Or beyond 1,000 miles. So X, so our domain, X is greater than or equal to 0. All right, so now let's move over to step number 3. It says use the reasonable domain and the graph to determine the reasonable range. Now, when we are looking at our range, which is our Y values right here, one thing I want to point out is that the y-intercept is the starting point for the graph, right? The y-intercept is normally the starting point in the graph, simply because the y-intercept, like by definition, is the value of y that crosses the y-axis when x equals to 0, right? So if x equals to 0, then that means for this particular situation that the domain starts at 3, is 0 comma 3. Therefore, and not domain, I'm sorry, range. Therefore, our range values will be y is greater than or equal to 3. It cannot be below 3, simply because our starting point is the y-axis, the y-intercept. And if the y-intercept is the number for y when x equals 0 and x is equal to miles, that means at 0 miles, the cost was $3. So when you jumped into the taxi, before the taxi takes off, before the taxi drives away, you have to pay the taxi $3. You have not traveled anywhere, you have not moved, right? So the reasonable range of that would be, at minimum, you would pay this man $3 just to get in his car. Okay. So now you're going to have an example on your own, where I want you guys to sketch the graph. Also answer, what's the reasonable domain? What's the reasonable range?